April 4th, 1943. A maintenance depot outside Oran, Algeria. The North African sun beat down mercilessly on Technical Sergeant James Wilson as he surveyed the graveyard of damaged Sherman tanks that stretched across the dusty yard. His newly arrived maintenance company had been told these vehicles were beyond repair, destined for scrap. The German forces believed their superior panzer tanks would continue to dominate the battlefield against the American armor. They could not have been more wrong about what this specialized unit of mechanics was about to accomplish. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a segregated unit of African-American tank mechanics transformed the broken remnants of battle into specialized fighting vehicles that would change the course of the war in North Africa and beyond, proving that innovation and determination could overcome technological disadvantage in the most unexpected ways. Sergeant Wilson wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the twisted metal of a Sherman that had taken a direct hit from a German 88mm gun. The tank's right side was caved in, with blackened edges around a gaping hole. Most would consider it a total loss, but Wilson saw something different. "Roberts, come take a look at this," he called to Corporal Henry Roberts, who was already elbow-deep in the engine compartment of another damaged tank. Roberts pulled himself free and ambled over, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long ago lost its original color. "What you thinking, Sarge?" "I'm thinking we can salvage the transmission, the left track assembly, and most of the engine. That turret is gone, but the lower hull is solid," Wilson said, walking around the tank and tapping its armor with his wrench. Roberts nodded. "That makes 3 we can possibly combine into one working tank. But then what? Send it back out to get knocked out again?" Wilson stared at the horizon, where distant explosions occasionally lit up the sky. "Maybe not. I've been thinking about what Captain Reynolds said about the German tanks. Their armor's thicker, but they've got weaknesses." The 761st Tank Battalion Maintenance Company had arrived in North Africa just 2 weeks earlier. As a segregated African-American unit, they had been assigned to what the Army considered secondary duties, salvage and repair work far from the front lines. But their commanding officer, Captain Thomas Reynolds, a white officer from Pennsylvania, was different from most. Reynolds emerged from the makeshift headquarters tent, a clipboard in hand. He was a tall man with prematurely graying hair at his temples, his uniform immaculate despite the heat and dust. "Gentlemen, I've just received our new orders. We're to salvage what we can and ship the rest back to the States." "Sir, we've been looking at these tanks," Wilson said, straightening to attention. "I think we can do better than salvage parts." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Sergeant." "Some of these tanks were knocked out because the German 88s punch right through our frontal armor. But what if we could reinforce them? Maybe use armor plating from the scrapped tanks to double up protection in key areas?" Reynolds looked thoughtful. "That's not in our orders, Sergeant." "No, sir, but it's not against them either," Wilson replied carefully. "We're supposed to get as many tanks operational as possible. Doesn't say how we do it." Reynolds smiled slightly. "True enough. What else do you have in mind?" Wilson led Reynolds and Roberts to another Sherman, this one with its turret intact but its engine destroyed by a fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun isn't powerful enough against the Panzers, but some of these tanks have different guns salvaged from other vehicles. If we could modify the turrets... "You're talking about creating custom tanks," Reynolds said, his voice neutral but his eyes showing interest. "Yes, sir. Custom tanks built specifically to take on German armor. We've got the skills. Most of us worked on cars and farm equipment before the war. Specialist Davis over there was building racing engines in Indianapolis." Reynolds looked across the depot where 45 African-American soldiers were already hard at work, despite having been told they were merely a salvage operation. Men who had been mechanics, machinists, and metalworkers in civilian life, but rarely given the opportunity to use those skills in the segregated army. "The brass won't issue special equipment to a Negro unit," Reynolds said quietly. "You know that." "They don't need to know until after we've proven it works," Wilson replied. Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. He had seen firsthand what happened to Sherman crews when they encountered German tanks. The casualties were devastating. Finally he nodded. "Draw up detailed plans. I want to see exactly what you're proposing before I sign off on anything, and this stays between us until we have something to show." "Yes, sir," Wilson said, already mentally cataloguing the resources they had available. As Reynolds walked away, Roberts looked at Wilson. "You really think we can make these Shermans into tank killers?" "We have to," Wilson replied. "Those boys at the front are counting on us, even if they don't know it yet." That evening, in the mechanics' tent, Wilson gathered the key members of the company. They crowded around a makeshift table where Wilson had spread out technical drawings of the Sherman tank. "Listen up," Wilson began. "We've all heard about what's happening at the front. Our tanks are faster than the German panzers, but their armor can't stand up to German guns, and our 75mm can't penetrate their frontal armor effectively." Specialist Marcus Davis, a compact man with powerful hands and a reputation as the best engine man in the company, nodded. "The Sherman engine's good, but they rushed these tanks into production without proper testing. There's a reason they catch fire so easily. The boys call them Ronson lighters. Lights first time every time." A murmur of grim agreement passed through the group. The Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit was well known among the men who had to repair them. "So what's the plan, Sarge?" asked Technical Corporal Walter Jefferson, the company's best welder. "We're going to create specialized Shermans," Wilson said. "Captain Reynolds has given us provisional approval, provided we can show him solid plans." Wilson pointed to the drawings. "First problem, armor. We can salvage armor plate from damaged tanks and weld additional protection to the front slope and turret face where most hits occur." Jefferson leaned forward. "Double armor might work, but it'll add weight. That'll strain the suspension and reduce speed." "That's where Davis comes in," Wilson replied. "We need to get more power from these engines to compensate." Davis smiled slightly. "I've got some ideas about that. These Continental radials can put out more horsepower if we modify the fuel delivery system. Back home, we were getting 20% more power with the right adjustments." "Second problem, firepower," Wilson continued. "The 75mm gun just doesn't have the punch we need. But I've heard rumors about a new 76mm gun with better penetration. There are also some British 17-pounder guns that might work if we can get our hands on them." "Where would we get those?" asked Roberts skeptically. "Leave that to me and the captain," Wilson said. "For now, we focus on what we've got. Jefferson, I want you and your welding team to start designing armor reinforcement patterns. Davis, work up those engine modifications. Roberts, you're in charge of transmission improvements. These tanks throw tracks too easily when turning at speed." "What about the brass?" asked Jefferson. "They find out we're customizing tanks without authorization. We'll be in serious trouble." Wilson nodded. "Captain Reynolds is putting his career on the line for this. Says if we can prove the concept, he'll take responsibility. Until then, officially, we're just doing enhanced repairs." As the meeting broke up, Private First Class Nathan Townsend, the youngest member of the unit at just 19 years old, approached Wilson. "Sarge, I worked in my daddy's machine shop before the war. We did custom parts for all kinds of equipment. If you need precision components modified, I can help." Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "That's exactly what I need to hear, Townsend. Tomorrow you start working with Davis on those engine modifications." The next morning, the depot was a hive of activity. Captain Reynolds had arranged for a section of the maintenance area to be screened off from casual observation, using salvaged canvas and parked trucks to create a private workspace. There, the most promising Sherman candidates for modification were gathered. Reynolds approached Wilson as he supervised the removal of a damaged turret. "I've sent requisitions for replacement parts through official channels. The paperwork says exactly what we need, but describes them as standard replacement components." "Will that work, sir?" Wilson asked. "Probably not for everything, but it gives us official cover for some of the parts," Reynolds replied. "I've also reached out to some contacts in other units. There's a British armor unit nearby that might have some equipment we can borrow." Wilson raised his eyebrows, but said nothing about the captain's willingness to bend the rules. "I'm putting everything on the line for this, Sergeant," Reynolds said quietly, "because I've seen what happens when our boys go up against Tigers and Panthers with standard Shermans. If we can save lives by giving them better tanks, it's worth the risk." "We won't let you down, sir," Wilson assured him. Over the next 2 weeks, The 761st worked tirelessly. They developed a system where 3 damaged Shermans would yield 1 enhanced tank. The best components were salvaged and combined, with custom modifications added during reassembly. Davis had managed to coax an additional 100 horsepower from the Continental radial engine through careful modifications to the fuel system and a redesigned air intake. Jefferson's welding team had developed a method to add additional armor that distributed the weight properly, preventing undue stress on the suspension system. Roberts had improved the transmission to handle the extra weight and power, while Townsend had machined custom parts that allowed for better turret traverse speeds, critical for getting the first shot in tank combat. But the biggest breakthrough came when Captain Reynolds returned from a mysterious 3-day absence with a British officer and a covered truck. "Gentlemen," Reynolds announced to Wilson and the team leaders, "this is Lieutenant James Blackwood of the Royal Armoured Corps. He has something we need." Lieutenant Blackwood, a wiry man with a weathered face and the distinct bearing of a career soldier, nodded to the group. "Captain Reynolds tells me you chaps are working on something special, something that might help our lads at the front," Reynolds signaled, and the tarp covering the truck's cargo was pulled back, revealing 4 long gun barrels. "These are 17-pounder anti-tank guns," Blackwood explained. "Best armor-penetrating gun in the Allied arsenal right now. They're from tanks damaged beyond repair. Officially, they're being sent back to England for refurbishment." "Unofficially?" Wilson asked. "Unofficially, I never saw them after they were loaded on this truck," Blackwood replied with a thin smile. "Terrible shame they seem to have gone missing in transit." Reynolds looked at Wilson. "Can you make them work in a Sherman turret?" Wilson examined the guns, running his hand along one of the barrels. "It'll require significant modification to the turret. The recoil system is different. The breech is larger. We'll need to counterbalance the longer barrel." He looked up with determination. "But yes, sir, we can make it work." "Good," Reynolds said, "because we've just received word that the 2nd Armored Division will be engaging German forces near Kasserine Pass in 3 weeks. They're expecting heavy opposition, including Tiger tanks. We need to have at least 2 operational tanks ready by then." 3 weeks? Davis looked concerned. "That's cutting it close, Captain." "Then we'd better get to work," Wilson said. "Lieutenant Blackwood, we'll need any technical information you have on these guns." Blackwood handed over a leather case. "Everything you need is in there. Ammunition specifications, recoil data, ballistic tables. The works." As the British officer departed, Reynolds turned to Wilson. "This is it, Sergeant. Our chance to prove what your men can do." Wilson nodded. "We won't waste it, sir." The next 3 weeks were a blur of activity. The men worked in shifts around the clock, with Wilson often spending 20 hours a day overseeing the operation. 2 Shermans were selected for the 17-pounder modification, which the men had begun calling Fireflies, after hearing the British used that name for similar conversions. 3 more tanks were being enhanced with improved armor and engines, but keeping the American 75mm guns with specially modified ammunition that Davis and Townsend had developed, offering slightly better penetration. On the morning of the 21st day, Wilson stood with Reynolds as they inspected the 5 completed tanks. They didn't look radically different from standard Shermans at first glance. The additional armor had been skillfully integrated to maintain the tank's profile, and the modified 17-pounder guns, while longer, didn't immediately announce their presence. "They're not pretty," Wilson admitted, "but they'll fight." Reynolds nodded. "The true test will come in battle." He handed Wilson an envelope. "Orders just came through. You're to deliver these tanks to the 2nd Armored Division's forward maintenance depot near Kasserine. After that, you and your key team members will remain for 48 hours to brief the crews and provide technical support." Wilson looked surprised. "We're going to the front?" "The tanks are experimental modifications. You're the experts," Reynolds said. "Besides, I think you've earned the right to see if your work makes a difference." The convoy departed that afternoon. The 5 modified Shermans transported on flatbed trucks to avoid putting unnecessary mileage on them before battle. Wilson rode in the lead vehicle with Davis, Roberts, Jefferson and Townsend, following in the other trucks. The forward depot was located in an olive grove 10 miles behind the front lines. As they arrived, the sounds of distant artillery could be heard, a constant reminder of the battle raging just over the horizon. Major Frank Bellows of the 2nd Armored Division was waiting for them, his expression skeptical as he watched the modified Shermans being unloaded. "These are the special tanks I've been hearing about?" he asked Reynolds, who had accompanied the convoy. "They look like standard Shermans with some extra armor slapped on." "That's part of the idea, Major," Reynolds replied. "We didn't want to change the profile too much. German gunners are trained to recognize and prioritize certain tanks. These will hopefully buy our crews a few critical seconds of hesitation." Bellows circled one of the Firefly conversions, his experienced eye catching the longer gun barrel. "What's this? That's not a standard 75. "British 17-pounder, sir," Wilson explained, stepping forward. "It can penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at normal combat ranges." Bellows looked at Wilson, then back at Reynolds, clearly surprised to see an African-American sergeant being presented as a technical expert. "And you are?" "Technical Sergeant James Wilson, sir. My team performed the modifications on these vehicles." Reynolds nodded. "Sergeant Wilson and his men are the best tank mechanics in the theater, Major. They'll brief your crews on the specific handling characteristics and maintenance requirements of these modified Shermans." Bellows still looked doubtful, but nodded. "We've lost 17 tanks in the last week to those German heavies. At this point, I'm willing to try anything. Let's see what these can do." The tank crews were assembled, experienced men with weary eyes who had seen too many of their comrades killed in inferior tanks. They listened with increasing interest as Wilson and his team explained the modifications. "The additional frontal armor means you can withstand hits that would have penetrated before," Jefferson explained. "But it's still best not to take direct hits if you can avoid it." "The modified engine gives you better acceleration and top speed," Davis added. "But watch the temperature gauge carefully. Push it too hard for too long and you'll risk overheating." Sergeant Alan Parker, commander of one of the Firefly-equipped tanks, raised his hand. "What about this new gun? How's the ammunition different?" Townsend stepped forward. "The 17-pounder uses separate ammunition. The projectile and propellant are loaded separately. It takes some getting used to, but we've modified the turret layout to make it more efficient. Your loader will need to develop a new rhythm. And the ballistics," Parker pressed. "Flatter trajectory, higher velocity," Juan Wilson explained. "You'll need less elevation adjustment at range. The gun can penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to take on any German tank you'll encounter." The crews spent the rest of the day familiarizing themselves with the modified tanks, running through drills and practice loading sequences. Wilson and his team worked alongside them, making minor adjustments and answering questions. As evening fell, Major Bellows called Wilson and Reynolds to his command tent. A map was spread out on a field table, with unit markers showing the current battle lines. "The situation is this," Bellows explained. "German armor has broken through here and here." He pointed to 2 locations on the map. "We believe they have at least a dozen Tigers and perhaps 20 Panzer Mark IVs. We're mounting a counterattack at dawn, and your modified tanks will be right in the middle of it." Wilson looked at Reynolds, who nodded slightly. "Sir, request permission to accompany the tanks tomorrow," Wilson said. "As observers, if there are any mechanical issues, we can address them immediately." Bellows frowned. "The front line is no place for mechanics, Sergeant, even ones who think they've built a better tank." "With respect, sir," Reynolds interjected, "these vehicles are prototypes. Having the designers on hand could make the difference between success and mechanical failure at a critical moment." Bellows considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but you'll stay with the command element 500 yards back from the advance. I'm not risking non-combat personnel any closer than that." As they left the tent, Reynolds looked at Wilson. "You sure about this? It's not in your orders to go forward." "Those are our tanks, Captain," Wilson replied simply. "We need to be there." The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the rumble of tank engines warming up. Wilson and his team had been up for hours, making final checks on the 5 modified Shermans that would soon head into battle. "Remember what I told you about the fuel mixture," Davis was saying to a tank driver. "If it starts to run rough, adjust it 1/4 turn and no more." Nearby, Jefferson was showing a tank commander the additional weld points on the turret. "These are the strongest points. If you can, Try to angle the tank so hits land here." Sergeant Parker approached Wilson as he finished inspecting the 17-pounder gun on Parker's tank. "Level with me, Sergeant. Are these modifications really going to make a difference against Tigers?" Wilson met his gaze steadily. "The 17-pounder can penetrate a Tiger's armor. The extra protection might give you a second chance if you take a hit. The rest depends on you and your crew." Parker nodded, accepting the honest assessment. "Most of the guys thought it was a joke when we heard Negro mechanics had built special tanks for us. Nobody's laughing now. These are the best-looking Shermans I've seen in North Africa. Just bring them and yourselves back in one piece," Wilson replied. "That's all we ask." As the sky began to lighten, the tanks moved out, forming up in attack formation. Wilson and his team joined Captain Reynolds in a command half-track that would follow the advance at a distance. Major Bellow's voice crackled over the radio. "All units advance according to plan. Baker Company, remember to protect the flanks of our modified tanks. I want those Fireflies engaging German armor at maximum range." The battlefield was a rolling plain dotted with low hills and occasional stands of scrubby trees. Perfect tank country. The American force advanced steadily, with the 5 modified Shermans positioned in the center of the formation, protected on both sides by standard tanks and infantry carriers. For 20 minutes, they moved forward without contact. Then came the radio call everyone had been dreading. "Enemy armor sighted, 11 o'clock, range 2,000 yards. Through binoculars, Wilson could make out the distinctive silhouettes of German tanks emerging from behind a distant ridgeline. The unmistakable angular shape of Tiger tanks was among them. "They've spotted us," Reynolds commented, as the German tanks began to maneuver into firing positions. The radio crackled again with Parker's voice. "This is Firefly 1, we have the range, requesting permission to engage." "Negative, Firefly 1, came Bellow's response. "Continue advance to planned engagement line." Wilson gripped the side of the half-track tightly. The German tanks would open fire any moment, and the American force was still closing the distance. It seemed madness not to take advantage of the 17-pounder's superior range. A flash erupted from one of the Tiger tanks, followed by the distinctive crack of its 88mm gun. A standard Sherman to the right of the formation erupted in flames as the shell found its mark. "All units, engage at will," Bellows ordered, abandoning the original plan in the face of German fire. Immediately, Parker's Firefly tank halted and rotated its turret. Through his binoculars, Wilson watched as the long 17-pounder gun elevated slightly, took aim and fired. The distance was great, but the effect was immediate. The Tiger that had just fired jerked backward, smoke pouring from a hole punched clean through its frontal armor. "Hit!" Parker's excited voice came through the radio. "Direct penetration on Tiger at 2,000 yards. A cheer went up from the American lines, but there was no time for celebration. The battle had been joined in earnest now, with both sides firing rapidly. The standard Shermans were forced to close to within 1,000 yards to be effective against the German armor, putting them at grave risk. But the 2 Fireflies hung back, using their superior range to pick off German tanks one by one. The 3 Shermans with enhanced armor and standard guns moved forward more aggressively, using their improved speed to flank the heavier but slower German tanks. Wilson watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as the tanks his team had modified performed in combat. So far they were exceeding expectations, but the battle was far from over. A German shell struck one of the enhanced Shermans directly on its reinforced frontal armor. The tank shuddered under the impact, but continued moving. The additional armor had done its job. "They're pulling back!" Reynolds exclaimed suddenly, pointing to the German line. Several of the remaining panzers were beginning to retreat, clearly surprised by the unexpected effectiveness of the American tanks. But one Tiger tank commander was made of sterner stuff. Instead of retreating, his tank charged forward, firing as it came. Its shell struck the ground near Parker's Firefly, showering it with dirt and debris but causing no damage. Parker responded with a perfectly aimed shot that struck the Tiger's right track, immobilizing it. A second shot from the other Firefly penetrated the Tiger's side armor, causing an internal explosion that blew the heavy turret completely off the hull. The remaining German tanks accelerated their withdrawal, disappearing back behind the ridgeline. On the American side, cheers erupted from tank commanders and infantry alike. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Bellows ordered over the radio. "All units hold position and report status." The casualty report was sobering but far better than typical encounters with German heavy tanks. 3 standard Shermans had been destroyed, with 7 crewmen killed and 5 wounded. But all 5 of the modified tanks had survived, with only minor damage to 2 of them. More impressively, they had confirmed the destruction of 4 Tiger tanks and 6 Panzer IVs, an unprecedented kill ratio for American armor in North Africa. As the battlefield fell silent except for the crackle of burning vehicles, Wilson and his team moved forward to inspect their creations. Parker's Firefly had taken superficial damage from near misses, but remained fully operational. The modified engine was running smoothly despite the extended combat, and the 17-pounder gun had performed flawlessly. "We need to check the recoil mechanism," Wilson told Parker as he climbed onto the tank. "How many rounds did you fire?" 22, Parker replied with a grin, "and 15 of them hit something important. This gun is something else, Sergeant. It's like having a sniper rifle instead of a shotgun." Major Bellows arrived in a staff car, jumping out almost before it had stopped moving. His earlier skepticism had vanished. "Captain Reynolds, Sergeant Wilson, those tanks performed beyond anything I could have expected." "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied. "They held up well, but we'll need to make some adjustments based on what we've observed." "Adjustments?" Bellows looked surprised. What could possibly need improvement after a performance like that? "The turret rotation was slightly sluggish on the Fireflies after sustained fire," Wilson explained, "and the enhanced armor on Tank 3 showed signs of stress at the mounting points. We can fix both issues easily." Bellows shook his head in amazement. "You know, when Reynolds first told me about Negro mechanics building specialized tank killers, I thought he'd lost his mind. I couldn't have been more wrong." He extended his hand to Wilson. "Extraordinary work, Sergeant, truly extraordinary." That evening, as Wilson and his team performed maintenance on the modified tanks, a jeep arrived carrying Colonel James Harrison, the regimental commander. He conferred briefly with Major Bellows before approaching the maintenance area. "Sergeant Wilson?" the colonel called. Wilson set down his tools and stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant. I've just received a full report from Major Bellows about today's action." Harrison gestured to the tanks. "High tells me these modifications made all the difference." "It was a team effort, sir," Wilson replied. "Every man in my company contributed something to these vehicles." Harrison nodded. "That's what I wanted to hear about. Your company, the 761st, correct? A Negro maintenance unit that apparently knows more about tanks than our design bureaus back home." Wilson said nothing, unsure where this was heading. "I've sent a priority communication to Theater Command," Harrison continued. "I'm recommending that your unit be redesignated as a technical development company with expanded authority to continue these modifications. I'm also recommending commendations for you and your key personnel." Wilson was momentarily speechless. "Thank you, sir. The men will be proud to hear that." "Don't thank me yet," Harrison said with a slight smile, "because I'm also requisitioning your entire unit to support our armored divisions. The Germans have had their own way for too long. It's time we showed them what American ingenuity can do." As Harrison departed, Reynolds approached Wilson. "Well, Sergeant, it looks like you and your men are going to be very busy for the foreseeable future." Wilson looked at the tanks his team had created, machines that had already saved American lives and would save many more in the battles to come. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Captain." 2 weeks later, the 761st had been moved to a larger facility near the front lines. They had been reinforced with additional personnel and equipment, and a steady stream of damaged Shermans arrived daily for modification. Word had spread among the armored units about the special Shermans that could take on Tigers, and tank crews began specifically requesting the modified vehicles. The informal name Wilson's Killers started appearing painted on the sides of tanks that had received the upgrades. Wilson was inspecting a newly modified turret when Captain Reynolds found him. "Sergeant, we've got visitors." Wilson looked up to see a group of officers approaching, led by a brigadier general he didn't recognize. Reynolds quietly murmured, "That's General Maxwell, head of armored development for the European theater." Wilson quickly wiped his hands and stood at attention as the general approached. "So you're Sergeant Wilson," General Maxwell said without preamble. "The man who's been rebuilding my tanks without authorization." Wilson swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Maxwell's stern expression suddenly broke into a smile. "Well, normally I'd have you court-martialed for that kind of insubordination, but it's hard to argue with results." He gestured to the tanks in various stages of modification around the depot. "What you've done here is nothing short of revolutionary." "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied, relaxing slightly. "I've brought some people from Aberdeen Proving Grounds," Maxwell continued, indicating two civilian engineers who were already examining one of the Firefly conversions with obvious interest. "They're here to document your modifications for potential implementation in future production models." Wilson looked surprised. "You're going to incorporate our changes into new tanks?" "Some of them, certainly," Maxwell confirmed, "particularly the armor improvements and engine modifications. The 17-pounder integration is more complicated due to supply constraints, but we're working on our own upgraded gun that incorporates similar principles." Maxwell turned to address both Wilson and Reynolds. "What I'm most interested in, though, is your team. You've accomplished more with salvage parts and improvised tools than our research divisions have with full factories at their disposal." "My men are exceptional, sir," Wilson said with quiet pride. "They just needed the opportunity to prove it." Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. "And that's exactly what I'm here to discuss. How would you feel about expanding your operation? Not just modifying existing tanks, but helping develop the next generation of American armor?" Wilson glanced at Reynolds, who gave him an encouraging nod. "We'd be honored, sir. But what, Sergeant?" "But we're still a segregated unit," Wilson said carefully. "There are limitations on what we're permitted to do under current regulations." Maxwell's expression hardened slightly. "Sergeant, when I see a tank burning on the battlefield with American boys inside, I don't care what color the mechanic was who might have saved them. This is war, and I need the best people doing the most important jobs." He looked around the depot at the African-American mechanics working diligently on the tanks. "As far as I'm concerned, I've found them." Over the next several months, the 761st was transformed. Officially redesignated as the 761st Technical Development Company, they received new equipment, expanded facilities, and priority access to parts and materials. Most importantly, they received official authorization to continue their modification program, now with the full backing of Armored Command. Their work expanded beyond the Sherman modifications to include other vehicles and weapon systems. Teams from the unit were dispatched to various frontline areas to provide technical support and gather feedback from combat units. Wilson himself was promoted to Master Sergeant and given operational control of the development program, with Captain Reynolds handling administrative matters and serving as liaison with higher command. By early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, more than 300 modified Shermans had been deployed to combat units, with documented success against German armor far exceeding that of standard tanks. On a warm afternoon in May 1944, Wilson was overseeing the final adjustments on a newly modified Sherman when a familiar voice called out to him, "Still improving these rolling coffins, I see." Wilson turned to find Sergeant Parker, now wearing lieutenant's bars, walking toward him with a broad smile. "Lieutenant Parker, good to see you made it through Tunisia in one piece." Parker clasped Wilson's hand firmly. "Thanks to you and your miracle workers. My Firefly accounted for 7 German tanks before we were rotated back for the invasion build-up." "I heard they're shipping some of our modified tanks to England for the invasion force," Wilson said. "More than some," Parker replied. "Word is that every armored division in the invasion force will have at least a company of Wilson Specials. That's what we're calling them now, by the way." Wilson shook his head, embarrassed by the recognition. "The men did the work. I just had the initial idea." "Ideas win wars, Sergeant," came General Maxwell's voice as he approached with Captain Reynolds, "especially when they're backed by the skill to implement them." Wilson and Parker snapped to attention, but Maxwell waved them to ease. "At ease, gentlemen. This isn't a formal inspection." "What brings you to our humble shop, General?" Wilson asked. Maxwell exchanged glances with Reynolds before answering. "Two things, actually. First, I wanted to personally inform you that the modified Sherman has been approved for limited production. The factories back home won't be able to implement all your changes in time for the invasion, but they're rushing through a new variant with the improved armor configuration and enhanced engine. Wilson felt a surge of pride. The work they had done here, far from the factories and research facilities of home, would help protect American tankers in the battles to come. "And the second reason, sir?" he asked. Maxwell handed Wilson an envelope. "These are your new orders." "Sergeant, or should I say Lieutenant Wilson?" Wilson stared at the envelope in shock. "Lieutenant?" "Battlefield Commission," Maxwell confirmed. "Approved by Theater Command and the War Department. You'll remain with the 761st, but as its commanding officer. Captain Reynolds is being reassigned to Armored Command Headquarters as my technical liaison." Reynolds stepped forward, smiling, and offered his hand to Wilson. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. No one deserves it more." Wilson shook his hand, still trying to absorb the news. "Sir, I don't know what to say. A battlefield commission for a maintenance sergeant is unusual enough, but for a Negro soldier, unprecedented," Maxwell acknowledged. "But so are your achievements. The Army may be segregated, Lieutenant Wilson, but talent speaks for itself. Your unit has saved countless lives and helped turn the tide against German armor. That deserves recognition, regardless of color." As the General and Reynolds departed, Parker clapped Wilson on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. This calls for a celebration." Wilson looked around at the busy maintenance depot, where the men of the 761st continued their work, unaware of the historic nature of what had just occurred. Later, perhaps. Right now, we've still got tanks to modify. That evening, Wilson gathered the company to share the news of his promotion and the unit's new official status. The announcement was met with cheers and congratulations, but also with a sense of validation that went beyond military recognition. Corporal Roberts, now a technical sergeant himself, summed it up best. "They said we couldn't be tankers because we weren't smart enough or brave enough. So instead, we built tanks that even the Germans fear. I'd call that proving them wrong." Wilson nodded. "We've shown what we can do when given the chance. Now we need to keep showing them every day, with every tank we modify and every innovation we develop." As the summer of 1944 progressed and the Allied forces pushed deeper into France following the D-Day invasion, reports continued to filter back about the performance of the modified Shermans. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where German tanks held the advantage in the difficult terrain, the improved Shermans had proven invaluable. In August, Wilson received a visit from Colonel Harrison, now a brigadier general, who brought with him a visitor, Technical Sergeant Marcus Davis, recently returned from the European front. "Davis," Wilson greeted his former engine specialist warmly. "What brings you back to Africa? Last I heard, you were with the Forward Technical Support Team in Normandy." Davis, looking older and more weathered than when Wilson had last seen him, smiled tiredly. "General Harrison requested I come brief you personally on how our tanks are performing in combat." "And?" Wilson prompted. "They're making a difference," Davis said simply. "Big difference. The standard Shermans are still struggling against Panthers and Tigers, but our modifications are evening the odds. The Fireflies in particular, the British have started mass-producing their own version based on our early conversions." Harrison nodded confirmation. "The British Firefly is now a standard component in their armoured squadrons, one Firefly for every 4 standard Shermans. But what Davis has brought is even more significant." Davis opened a folder he was carrying and spread photographs across Wilson's desk. They showed a new Sherman variant with a noticeably different turret and gun. "This is the Sherman 76, Davis explained. "It's based directly on our modifications, with a new high-velocity 76mm gun that can penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. They've also incorporated our armor improvements and engine modifications." Wilson studied the photographs with intense interest. "This is in production now," Harrison nodded. "Full production since June. Over 800 have already been shipped to Europe, with more coming every week. And that's not all." He nodded to Davis, who produced another set of photographs. These showed an entirely new tank design with a low profile and a massive gun. "This is the T-25, Harrison explained. The next-generation American medium tank, currently in development, with production expected to begin early next year. Its design incorporates many of the lessons learned from your modifications: better armor angles, more powerful engine, high-velocity gun as standard equipment. Wilson looked up from the photographs. Are you saying our work influenced this design? More than influenced, Harrison replied. The project lead at Aberdeen specifically credited the 761st's field modifications as the catalyst for several key design features. You've changed the way the Army thinks about tank development, Lieutenant. After Harrison and Davis departed, Wilson stood alone in the workshop, looking at the tanks in various stages of modification. What had begun as an unauthorized experiment born of necessity had grown into something that was changing the course of the war. He thought about the men who had made it possible: Roberts with his transmission innovations, Jefferson's armor welding techniques, Townsend's precision machining, Davis's engine modifications, and dozens of others who had contributed their skills and ideas. Men who had been told they weren't good enough to fight in tanks were now saving the lives of those who did. In the distance, the sun was setting over the North African desert, casting long shadows across the maintenance depot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tanks to modify, new problems to solve. But for tonight, Wilson allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that their work mattered, that they had proven what they could do when given the chance. In September 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany on all fronts, Wilson received new orders. The 761st was being transferred to the European theater, specifically to a massive tank depot in recently liberated France. We're going to be coordinating all Sherman modifications for the European front, Wilson explained to his assembled company. Our job will be to standardize the processes we've developed and train other maintenance units to implement them. The men received the news with mixed emotions. They had built something special in Africa, but the opportunity to directly support the push into Germany was exciting. The unit arrived in France in early October, establishing operations at a former French army base near Verdun. The facility was enormous compared to their African depot, with proper machine shops, welding bays, and testing grounds. Wilson, now a captain following another promotion, found himself commanding not just the 761st, but also overseeing several other maintenance companies, assigned to learn their techniques. On a cold November morning, as the first snow of the season dusted the test range, Wilson was observing trials of their latest modification, a flamethrower-equipped Sherman designed for clearing German bunkers, when a staff car arrived carrying Major General Maxwell. "Captain Wilson," Maxwell called, approaching with a broad smile. "Your reputation continues to grow. I've just come from SHAEF headquarters, where General Eisenhower himself asked about the miracle tanks coming out of Verdun." Wilson saluted. "Hardly miracles, sir. Just good engineering and dedicated men." "Speaking of your men," Maxwell said, his expression growing more serious, "that's partly why I'm here. There's a situation developing that requires your unique expertise." He handed Wilson a folder stamped "Top Secret." Inside were intelligence reports and photographs of a new German tank. "The Königstiger," Maxwell explained, as Wilson examined the documents. "What our intelligence boys are calling the King Tiger. 188 tons of steel with a 88mm high-velocity gun that can penetrate any armor we currently field. Frontal armor 150mm thick at 60 degrees, essentially impenetrable by our current weapons." Wilson studied the photographs with a tank designer's eye. "Impressive, but I see weaknesses. It's underpowered for its weight, which means poor mobility. The side armor is much thinner than the front, and that massive gun means a slow turret traverse." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "Exactly the analysis our technical branch came up with, though it took them 3 weeks. The problem is these beasts are appearing in growing numbers along the front. If the Germans manage to concentrate them for a counterattack, they could do serious damage." "You want us to develop countermeasures," Wilson surmised. "More than that," Maxwell replied. "I want you to create a specific anti-Tiger tank, something that can go toe-to-toe with these monsters and win." Wilson considered the challenge. "We'd need a more powerful gun than anything currently mounted on a Sherman." "Which is why I've arranged this," Maxwell said, handing Wilson another document. This one was a transfer authorization for 25 90mm anti-aircraft guns. These have better penetration characteristics than even the 17-pounder. If you can make them work in a tank turret, we might have something that can challenge the King Tiger. We'll need to essentially rebuild the turret from scratch, Wilson said, already mentally calculating the modifications required, and significantly reinforce the hull to handle the recoil. Whatever you need, you'll have, Maxwell promised. This has the highest priority. We're expecting a major German counteroffensive sometime in the next month. I need at least a company of these special tank destroyers ready before then. As Maxwell departed, Wilson called for his team leaders. They gathered in the planning room where Wilson laid out the challenge before them. This is bigger than anything we've tackled before, and he told them. We're not just modifying existing tanks anymore, we're creating something entirely new. Technical Sergeant Townsend, now Wilson's chief of design, studied the specifications of the 90mm gun. The recoil force is massive, sir. We'll need to completely redesign the turret mounting and reinforce the hull at key points. The weight will be an issue too, added First Lieutenant Roberts, who had received his own battlefield commission and now handled mobility systems. Even with our engine modifications, putting this gun on a standard Sherman chassis will make it dangerously underpowered. Wilson nodded. Which is why we're not using the standard chassis. I've been looking at the M10 tank destroyer chassis. It's based on the Sherman but designed specifically for heavier weapons. We'll start with those and modify from there. Over the next 3 weeks, the 761st worked around the clock. The design evolved rapidly, with daily tests and adjustments. They stripped the open turrets from the M10 chassis and constructed new, fully enclosed turrets capable of housing the 90mm gun. The frontal armor was angled more steeply, mimicking the effective design of the Russian T-34, while the sides received additional protection without compromising mobility too severely. By early December, they had completed 5 prototypes, designated the M10 Wolverine by Maxwell's headquarters, in recognition of their ferocious anti-tank capability. On the test range, the Wolverines performed beyond expectations. The 90mm gun could penetrate armor plate, equivalent to a King Tiger's frontal protection at ranges up to 1,500 yards. The modified chassis provided good mobility despite the additional weight, and the new turret design offered better protection for the crew than standard Shermans. As the final preparations were being made to ship the first company of Wolverines to the front, news arrived that shook the Allied High Command. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. "We need those tank destroyers at the front immediately," General Maxwell told Wilson during an emergency visit to the depot. "Reports indicate King Tiger's leading the German advance, and our standard tanks are being cut to pieces." "The first 20 are ready, sir," Wilson reported, "but the crews haven't completed their training. These vehicles handle differently from standard Shermans." Maxwell's expression was grim. "There's no time for complete training. The situation is critical. I need your best men to accompany the Wolverines and provide on-the-job instruction to the crews." Wilson straightened. "Request permission to lead the deployment myself, sir." Maxwell hesitated. "You're more valuable here, Captain, continuing the production." "With respect, sir, no one knows these vehicles better than I do. Lieutenant Roberts can handle production while I'm gone." After a moment's consideration, Maxwell nodded. "Very well, but this is a temporary field deployment only. Get the crews up to speed and then return. That's an order, Captain." 2 days later, a convoy of 20 Wolverines, accompanied by Wilson and a team of technical specialists from the 761st, arrived at the headquarters of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, one of the units desperately trying to stem the German advance. Colonel William Harper, the Combat Command's leader, greeted Wilson with visible relief. "Captain Wilson, I've heard about your special tanks. They couldn't have arrived at a better time." Harper led Wilson to a map showing the current battle lines. "The situation is this. German armor, including at least a company of King Tigers, has broken through here and is pushing toward this road junction." He pointed to a small Belgian town named Bastogne. "If they take it, they'll have a clear path to the Meuse River. We've got elements of the 101st Airborne dug in at Bastogne, but they need armor support, particularly anti-tank capability. Our Wolverines were designed specifically to counter the King Tiger, Wilson said, but the crews will need at least basic familiarization before going into combat. Harper shook his head grimly. We don't have that luxury, Captain. The Germans are pushing hard and we need every tank we can get on the line. He checked his watch. You've got 6 hours to get your crews up to speed. At 0600 tomorrow, your company moves out as part of the relief force heading to Bastogne. That night, under hastily erected floodlights, Wilson and his team conducted an accelerated training program for the tank crews assigned to the Wolverines. Most were experienced Sherman operators, but the new tank destroyers presented unique challenges. The gun has more drop at range than you're used to, Wilson explained to the gathered gunners. Use the new ballistic tables we've provided and adjust accordingly. And remember, the turret traverses more slowly because of the weight of the 90mm. Plan your target acquisition accordingly. To the commanders, he emphasized the Wolverine's strengths and weaknesses. You've got the firepower to take on any German tank, including the King Tiger, but you're still more lightly armored than they are. Use your superior mobility to get on their flanks whenever possible. And never, ever engage a King Tiger frontally unless you have absolute surprise and can hit them before they hit you. As dawn broke on December 20th, the company of Wolverines, now designated Company D of the 9th Armored's 76th Tank Battalion, prepared to move out. Snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility and making the narrow Belgian roads treacherous. Wilson had been assigned as technical advisor to the company commander, Captain Frank Bellamy, a veteran tanker with 3 years of combat experience. These tanks better be as good as advertised. Captain Wilson, Bellamy said as they prepared to depart, we're heading into the teeth of the German advance. They'll do their job, Wilson assured him. Just make sure your men remember their training. The column moved out, advancing through the snow-covered Ardennes toward Bastogne. Progress was slow due to the weather and the congested roads, which were clogged with vehicles heading to and from the front. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the village of Noville, just north of Bastogne, where elements of the 101st Airborne were engaged in heavy fighting with advancing German forces. The sounds of battle were clearly audible as they approached, the sharp crack of anti-tank guns, the deeper boom of tank cannons, and the constant rattle of small arms fire. Colonel Harper met them at a makeshift command post in a damaged farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. Situation's deteriorating, he reported grimly. German armor is pushing from the northeast. Intelligence confirms at least 6 King Tigers leading the advance, with Panzer V's and infantry support. Bellamy studied the hastily drawn battle map. Recommend we deploy along this ridgeline, sir. Good fields of fire and some cover from those woods on the right flank. Harper nodded. Do it. The airborne boys have been holding with bazookas and light anti-tank guns, but they can't stop those heavy tanks for long. Your Wolverines are our best hope of blunting this attack. As the Wolverines moved into position along the ridgeline, Wilson accompanied Bellamy in the command tank. Through his binoculars, he could make out German infantry advancing through the distant tree line, with the unmistakable blocky shapes of tanks moving behind them. Contact, 2 o'clock, range 2,000 yards, called the gunner. Heavy tanks, at least 5, maybe more. Hold fire until my command, Bellamy ordered over the radio. All Wolverines target the lead tanks only. We need to disrupt their formation. Wilson watched tensely as the German tanks emerged from the trees. The massive King Tigers were even more impressive in person than in photographs, their long 88mm guns scanning for targets as they advanced methodically across the snow-covered field. Range 1,600 yards, reported the gunner. I have a clear shot at the lead tank. Bellamy glanced at Wilson, who nodded. This is well within the effective range of the 90mm. All Wolverines, engage targets, Bellamy commanded. Almost simultaneously, 5 of the Wolverines fired. Through his binoculars, Wilson saw 3 hits on the lead King Tiger. 2 shells struck its frontal armor at an angle and ricocheted off, but the third hit squarely and penetrated. The massive German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The German advance momentarily faltered as the commanders assessed this unexpected development. They were accustomed to American tanks being ineffective against their heavy armor at this range. Then the German tanks began to maneuver, seeking to bring their own powerful guns to bear. A King Tiger fired, its shell passing just over the turret of Bellamy's Wolverine and exploding in the trees behind them. "All units, change positions after firing," Bellamy ordered. "Don't let them zero in on you." The battle developed into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Wolverines would fire, then quickly shift position to avoid return fire. Their mobility advantage over the heavier King Tigers proved crucial in the confined battlefield. By dusk, 3 King Tigers had been destroyed, with 2 more damaged and withdrawing. The Wolverines had lost 3 of their number, with 2 more damaged but repairable. More importantly, the German advance toward Bastogne had been halted, at least temporarily. As night fell, Wilson helped organize repairs on the damaged Wolverines, while Bellamy reported to Colonel Harper. "Your tank destroyers performed beyond expectations, Captain," Harper told Wilson when he arrived at the command post later. "The airborne commander says they're the first American tanks he's seen that didn't immediately back off when King Tigers appeared." Wilson accepted the compliment with a nod. "They're doing what they were designed to do, sir, but we need to address some issues I observed during the engagement." Over the next several days, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, Wilson remained with the Wolverine Company, making field modifications and advising the crews on tactics. The specialized tank destroyers became a critical asset, repeatedly blunting German armored thrusts with their superior firepower. Word of the Tiger Killers, as they became known, spread quickly through the American forces, boosting morale at a critical time when the German offensive had shaken confidence. On Christmas Day, as a lull settled over the battlefield, Wilson received orders to return to the maintenance depot. The Wolverines had proven themselves in combat, and his expertise was needed to accelerate production of more units. Captain Bellamy saw him off as a jeep, prepared to take Wilson to the airfield for transport back to Verdun. "My men want you to know that these tanks saved their lives," Bellamy said, shaking Wilson's hand warmly. "When this war's over, I hope you get the recognition you deserve for what you've created." Wilson smiled slightly. "It wasn't just me, Captain. It was every man in the 761st. We did what we were trained to do, solve problems and keep the army moving." As the jeep pulled away, Wilson looked back at the snow-covered battlefield, where American and German forces continued their struggle for supremacy. The Wolverines, with their distinctive profile and powerful guns, stood out among the gathered vehicles, a testament to what his unit had accomplished. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany, the 761st Tank Technical Development Company had been recognized as one of the most innovative units in the European theater. Their modifications and designs had been implemented across the American armored forces, saving countless lives and helping turn the tide against supposedly superior German armor. In March, as the war in Europe drew toward its inevitable conclusion, Wilson received new orders. The 761st was being transferred back to the United States, to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, where they would join the team developing the next generation of American tanks. On their last day in Europe, General Maxwell visited the depot to personally thank the unit for their service. "What you men have accomplished here will change the future of American armored warfare," he told the assembled company. "You've proven that innovation and ingenuity are more powerful than any weapon the enemy can field." As they prepared to depart, Wilson took a final walk through the facility that had been their home for the past several months. The workshops were quieter now, with most of the unit's equipment already packed for shipment, but a single Wolverine remained in the main bay, undergoing final adjustments before joining a combat unit. Wilson ran his hand along the tank's angular armor, remembering the day when a small group of African-American mechanics had looked at damaged Shermans in a North African depot and seen not scrap metal, but opportunity. "Ready to go, Captain?" asked Lieutenant Roberts, approaching with the last of the personnel manifests. Wilson nodded, taking a final look at the tank. "Ready? We've got new challenges waiting back home." "And they'll never expect what we're capable of," Roberts added with a smile, echoing the sentiment that had defined their unit from the beginning. On May 7, 1945, as news of Germany's surrender spread across the world, the men of the 761st gathered in their new workshop at Aberdeen. They had already begun work on projects that would influence American tank design for decades to come, their expertise now fully recognized and valued. Wilson, recently promoted to major, called the company to attention. "Gentlemen, today marks the end of the war in Europe. What you accomplished there, the lives you saved, the innovations you created, will be remembered long after the details of individual battles are forgotten." He paused, looking at the faces of the men who had proven themselves not just as mechanics, but as engineers, innovators, and warriors in their own right. When we began this journey in North Africa, the German forces believed their tanks were invincible, that no American vehicle could stand against them. They never expected that a company of black mechanics could turn broken Shermans into tank killers that would help defeat their most powerful weapons. He raised a cup in a toast. "To the 761st. We changed the course of the war, one tank at a time." In the years that followed, the innovations developed by the 761st would influence American tank design through the Cold War and beyond. The lessons learned from their field modifications would be taught at the Armor School and the Corps of Engineers. Their story would become part of military history, a testament to what could be accomplished when talent was recognized regardless of color. And for the men who had served in that extraordinary unit, there remained the quiet pride of knowing that when given the opportunity, they had not merely met expectations, they had shattered them, creating weapons that helped secure victory in humanity's greatest conflict. They had proven once and for all that innovation knows no color, and that in the arsenal of democracy, their contribution had been essential to victory. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.